Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 9th of January 2015. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks Robbie for the new year.
In this week's CEC Report, wave of terrorism is not Islamic. It is Wahhabi, sponsored by Saudi and British royals. And we're in the foothills of the next great financial crash. So first, wave of terrorism is not Islamic. It is Wahhabi, sponsored by Saudi and British royals. And of course, Craig, yes, it is the new year, but already it's not a happy new year, as everybody would know by now with the news that's come out of France. The massacre of 12 people there. And just before Christmas, and it was just after we did our last show for last year, you had a terrorist incident in Sydney, right, which terrified the people of Australia. And of course, what you got now is you've got politicians like Tony Abbott in Australia and David Cameron in the UK. They're just whipping up the public to cower in fear, accept more fascist anti-terrorism laws, because of course you're supposed to believe that you've got to be looking over your shoulder. Every Muslim's a potential terrorist out to get you, etc. When in fact, the self-righteousness that we get from them is pure hypocrisy, because they are covering for the source of this terrorism, and it's got nothing to do with the religion of Islam. It's a specific sect that exists within Islam that is sponsored by the allies of countries like the United Kingdom, the United States and Australia, namely Saudi Arabia and Qatar and these powers.
I think it's also important, Robbie, that to mention that last year when we released our new citizen, we covered in that a very important press release that was issued back in September forecasting the sort of event that took place in Martin Place last year.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is not rocket science from the point of view. When you understand that the world is going through the process of financial disintegration, the transatlantic financial and monetary system is in the process of disintegrating. The British Empire, through its financial centres of London and Wall Street, are trying to grab hold of, maintain power, and the way that they're going to do that is through bringing in various fascist controls. And what you see is these sorts of events, like we saw in Martin Place, are facilitating the motion to bring in more and more legislation to restrict and to control the population.
Well, they use terrorism as a strategic weapon. And I remember back in 2002, I think, Craig, when the Bush-Cheney White House was trying to use 9/11 to, lead us all into the Iraq War. Lyndon LaRouche at the time made a very important statement where he said, all terrorism is state-sponsored. There is no lone wolf, there is no lone gunman, there is no lone nut job, right? You've got, there's a purpose for this, because of course there's nothing like terrorism to set off this almost on autopilot, this reaction where everyone starts chasing their tails, etc., and then you end up with fascist laws and those types of things.
I think also, Robbie, if you go back and look at our last New Citizen, we did publish a very, very important article in that New Citizen on page 4, which of course is how the Prince Charles is the very best friend of Saudi Arabia. Charles of Arabia, right? It's a pretty stunning picture, and it's also shocking if some people don't realise this. But I mean, he has an enormous number of intimate friends that are part of Saudi Arabia, that are princes of Saudi Arabia and so forth.
Yeah, and specifically the ones he's closest to are the ones who specifically are provably the controllers of these terror networks. So we're going to go through a little bit of that now, but the source of what we're going through, we encourage the readers or the viewers of this program should go and look for themselves. So it's our New Citizen, the latest New Citizen. All you've got to do is call in and ask for the latest New Citizen from that we put out towards the end of last year with the Charles of Arabia story. Also a press release we did just before Christmas called CEC's Isherwood on the Sydney Islamist Siege. Quote, let's ask Prince Charles what he knows about it. And there's a lot of detail in that press release. And we're just going to summarise some of that here, just so that people understand how well known this connection is and what also Saudi Wahhabism actually is. So, first of all, I want to make this point. To be frank, Craig, we're not, the kinds of cartoons that this publication in Paris did are pretty disgusting, and they knew they were taking a risk. But no one deserves to die ever. These cartoons, though, were pretty disgusting. What they're trying to do is they're caricaturing Islam, but they're wrong in doing that. And what's wrong about it is because what they're caricaturing is not representative of Islam. Mm-hmm. It is, however, representative of a specific sect within Islam, and that sect is Wahhabism. Now, Wahhabism, I want to read you a little definition that came from the June 27, 2014 issue of our EIR magazine by Ramtanu Maitra. What is Wahhabism? And he just makes the point, Wahhabism is the most reactionary and rigid sect in all Islam, which advocates a fusion of state power and religion, and a caliphate, which is a single Islamic theocratic state. And that's what supposedly ISIS is setting up. And then he says this, quote, "What sets Wahhabism apart from other Sunni Islamist movements is its historical obsession with purging Sufis, Shiites, and other Muslims who do not conform to its twisted interpretation of Islamic scripture." End quote. Now, the reason Ramtanu has to devote a page explaining this is because this extreme strain of Islam is very powerful because of its sponsors. And its sponsors are the Saudi Arabian royal family and the Qatar royal family. But he makes the point that the Saudi royals could not exist without Wahhabism, and Wahhabism could not exist without the Saudi royals. And then the British royals come into it because when the British first colonised Bahrain in 1820 and started their encroachment onto the Arabian Peninsula, the first people they allied with were the Wahhabist Saudis, and that became their foothold as they increasingly took over the Arabian Peninsula, right? And it's been that case ever since, from that moment on, from that time on. Now, fast forward to today. One of the people in this picture, in fact, the top left, the man at Prince Charles's top left is Prince Bandar bin Sultan, and we'll talk about him again in a second. He's the former long-time ambassador to the United States. He was, there was some nickname about, there's a good picture we'll put up that shows him with Bush at the Bush family ranch. Very good close friend of the Bush family, but equally good close friend of Prince Charles. And he's currently the head of Saudi intelligence. Now, of course, the King of Saudi Arabia had 1 million sons and they've all got jobs in the government and that's how they run it, right? And by the way, as an aside, I think Saudi Arabia broke some record last year for public beheadings of people because that's the way they execute people. So you hear our media rail against human rights in China and all this kind of stuff, but no one ever touches on what the allies in Saudi Arabia are up to. But anyway, in a book that exposes this character, Prince Bandar, sorry, not in a book, in an article in the London Independent on the 13th of July 2014 by a senior British author, Patrick Coburn. He reports of MI6 head, British MI6 head Sir Richard Dearlove, reporting how Prince Bandar said to him sometime before 9/11, so back in 2001 or 2000, whatever, this Prince Bandar said to the head of MI6, quote, "The time is not far off in the Middle East, Richard, when it will be literally, God help the Shia. More than 1 billion Sunnis have simply had enough of them," end quote. And of course, Craig, what we actually have witnessed ever since, and especially now in ISIS and these types of movements, we in the West are afraid about what these Muslims are going to do to us. What a lot of people might not realise is their chief target is Shiite Muslims. They're the ones that they are determined to wipe off the face of the earth and anyone associated with them. So let's take a quick break, and when we'll come back, we're going to continue on this subject. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing the subject, wave of terrorism is not Islamic, It is Wahhabi, sponsored by Saudi and British royals. And we're talking about the connection between Prince Charles on behalf of the British royal family with the Saudi royals who sponsor the Wahhabi sect. That is what all these terrorists believe in. Now, and one of their targets, of course, is their fellow Muslims who are not of their sect, which is Shiites. And that's what separates Wahhabis from every other Muslim sect. They don't believe in live and let live. They believe in wiping out all the heretics in their religion.
And of course, what we see, Robbie, is that the conflict between the Wahhabism, which is actually the driver with all of Islam, is what is being painted internationally. This is what Islam is all about, and it isn't.
Exactly.
I mean, we live here in Coburg. There's a lot of Islamic, people around here, Muslim people around here, and we've lived next door to people, of course, for many decades actually.
And I'll say to the viewers as a preemptive word of warning. I mean, we love people communicating with us with email and whatever, but if you're going to send us stuff railing against Muslims and you don't bother to call in and get this material and read it and actually learn about the different shades of grey involved here and know what you're talking about, we're not interested, because we do know what we're talking about. We've got reams of this stuff. But anyway, that's just that'll deal with the 1%, Craig, hopefully. All right. Okay. I want to issue a caution here. Don't swallow every snippet of information about things like this Paris terrorist attack as truth, right? Because you never know. However, given that caution, if the reports that we've heard are that at least one of the gunmen has just come back from Syria, right, then that is another case of Saudi-sponsored Wahhabi terrorism, because that is who these terrorists. We've got a wave of terrorism that we've sadly become used to, and it's all sponsored by this same outfit. So before the break, I made a factual error, Craig, saying that Prince Bandar is the current head of Saudi intelligence. He was the head of Saudi intelligence until last year. He's no longer the current head, but he's still one of their top guys and point men for Prince Charles. So Al-Qaeda, the infamous Al-Qaeda is, and from the Saudi Osama bin Laden himself, they are Saudi-sponsored Wahhabis. ISIS, this latest monstrous manifestation of it, is Saudi-sponsored Wahhabis. The terrorists, the jihadists that we backed, and when I say we were sort of a bit incidental to it, but we certainly supported it. But the United States, United Kingdom, and dare I say it, France, backed to topple Gaddafi in Libya, were Saudi-sponsored jihadis. And then, of course, when one of these characters, who's a friend of Prince Charles, on the right-hand side of the Prince Charles picture there, you have a bunch of clerics, pictures of clerics who operate out of Prince Charles's sponsored Islamic Centre at Oxford University, and one of them issued the fatwas that launched the jihadist uprising against Gaddafi and against Assad in Syria, and so all these jihadists went to Syria to topple Assad over there, and they are Saudi-sponsored Wahhabis, right? So it's all the same crowd.
I think also, Robert, just to make a point here, is that the recent collapse in oil prices, which we'll touch on in the next segment, this is because the US has gone to Saudi Arabia and said, we want you to intervene here with the price of oil by maintaining a glut of 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day in order to force the price of oil down to attack Russia. So, because Russia's dependent on oil. Now, you see how Saudi Arabia is intimately involved.
It's a strategic asset for these dirty games.
Yes.
Exactly.
Not just in the terms of state-sponsored terrorism, but all forms of financial warfare and other.
No, exactly. It is an intimate part of this. So anyway, when the US Congress conducted an inquiry into 9/11 after it happened, there was an official report issued, and 28 pages of that report are still classified to this day. Why? Because everyone knows that those are the pages. Now, the pages dealt with the financing of the terrorist attack, and everyone knows what it actually deals with specifically is the Saudi financing of the terrorist attack. And specifically Prince Bandar, the same Prince Bandar and his wife, who personally are known to have financed at least 2 of the identified hijackers on 9/11, right? Now, former Senator Bob Graham, who headed up that investigation, he said to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, because he's tirelessly campaigning to have those pages declassified. And this is what he said, quote, I believe that had the role of Saudi Arabia in 9/11 been disclosed by the release of the 28 pages and by the declassification of other information as to the Saudi role and support of the 9/11 hijackers, that would have made it much more difficult for Saudi Arabia to have continued that pattern of behaviour, end quote. So, Craig, why hasn't it been declassified?
Because, Robbie, you're dealing with the top levels of the financial oligarchy, starting down from Prince Charles. And I think if you go back and have a look at the press release we put out before Christmas, you go and have a look at the work of investigative reporter Mark Hollingsworth, particularly where he reported on a meeting in 2003. I think it's in his book called Saudi Babylon, Torture, Corruption and the Cover-Up Inside the House of Saud. He reported on a meeting in 2003 at the New Scotland Yard between two top officials, senior British counter-terrorism officials and lawyers representing the families and victims of 9/11. The 9/11 lawyers raised the matter of the Saudi royal family financing of the hijackers of 9/11. And Hollingworth said in his book, quote, Prince Charles' relationships with prominent House of Saud members have created serious problems and obstacles to UK agencies investigating claims of Saudi financing of international terrorism, according to special branches sources. The delicacy and sensitivity of Prince Charles's friendship was raised during a meeting at New Scotland Yard in April of 2003. Families of the victims of 9/11 had filed a lawsuit accusing some members of the House of Saud, notably Defence Minister Prince Sultan and the new UK Ambassador Prince Turki, of supporting Al-Qaeda in the past. Their lawyers were in Europe investigating allegations that senior Saudi royals had backed Islamic charities run by the government which funded the 9/11 hijackers. And he goes on to say the meeting at Scotland Yard was attended by Detective Chief Inspector Stephen Ratcliffe, the Special Branch Officer in charge of tracking terrorism financing. Ratcliffe looked hesitant and somewhat sheepish, and he said, our ability to investigate the Saudis is very limited, he said. He then paused, looked across to a photograph of Prince Charles on the wall, raised his eyebrows and smiled knowingly without saying a word. He did not say anything, but the message was crystal clear when he looked at the picture, said a high-level police officer who was present. It was Prince Charles' special relationship with the Saudis which was a problem. He gave no other reason why they were restricted. Now, this happens a lot in the case of a lot of these sensitive matters.
And there's no place like Britain to cover up the truth and shut down investigations.
Well, when the Queen's the head of the police force, Robbie, you sort of wonder...
And MI6 and MI5.
And all of those, you sort of wonder how transparent things actually are. And you see from what we're exposing in our New Citizen articles that this goes very to the top of the monarchy.
So look, we're out of time, but just to reiterate for the viewers, an event like France happens or what happened in Sydney and you get enraged inside and morally outraged and you want to do something about it, don't be distracted by what should be done, because going after your fellow man is not the solution. We've got to go after where this is coming from in the highest places, and that's what the CEC's fight's about. So we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to change the subject to the coming next financial crash. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, we're in the foothills of the next great financial crash. Craig, the week before Christmas, the US Congress very sneakily repealed the only good measure in the Dodd-Frank Act. And just to explain, after the 2008 crisis, the Obama administration's response was this sort of like an 8,000-page piece of legislation called the Dodd-Frank Act, which was mostly rubbish, right? But there was there's two good measures in it, one and a half good measures in it. One's called the Volcker Rule's not bad, could be better, but this one was good though. And what it was a measure that said, okay, we're not going to bring back Glass-Steagall and make the banks break up, but if you have a big banking, operation like Citigroup, where inside that you have divisions, right? The division that has deposits, which under US law are insured by the government, by the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that division is not allowed to gamble in derivatives. That's all that's said, right? So, just before Christmas, a $1 trillion spending bill was agreed to between the Democrats and the Republicans that had to be passed by the Thursday, or else the government would have shut down. So nobody was allowed to vote against this, and both major parties had agreed to it. So what did they do? It's called an omnibus bill, which means people could go in and paperclip to it other measures that they wanted to get through sneakily that no one could possibly oppose. And one of them was Citigroup itself, the biggest bank in the world, wrote the actual measure that was pinned to this bill that said that part of the Dodd-Frank Bill Act is now repealed to allow them to once again attach derivatives to the division of their operation that has deposits. Not, that'll help them gamble more, but that's not the main point of it. It's so that those derivatives can be bailed out, because the US government would not let deposits go under without bailing them out, so those derivatives can now be bailed out.
And of course,
the
reason for that is the drop in oil prices has triggered, we don't even know yet because there's somewhat of a delay, it's triggered a meltdown of something like in the vicinity of $20 trillion of these derivative speculative assets,
exactly.
So-called assets. In
what
the
you
bubble.
said before the break, the Saudis and the Brits and Americans, they did set this off, but what they set off has become this uncontrollable meltdown. Right? And what people have to understand is before 2008, the derivatives bets were in mortgages. Well, that was a huge washout. Now they're in commodities, right, in a massive way. And there's all kinds of the oil price that we've had for 6 years has never been based on supply and demand, right? It's been based on this gambling. Those bets are now melting down, and they've had to get this measure repealed in time for the meltdown so that they can get themselves bailed out.
I think, Robbie, in terms of using the analogy, the foothills of the next general collapse, I don't know how far up the hill we are at the moment, but look, you've seen the oil price collapse by more than 50% in the last period of time. You've seen stock markets with big jitters. You've seen the euro being bailed out big time in the European by the European Central Bank and so forth. The point, Robbie, is that there's only one element of this which remains, and if people lose confidence in the system, that's when the crash can happen very quickly, because most of the issue holding up the system right now is simply a question of confidence. And when we saw the global financial crisis happen in 6 years ago now, it was an issue of confidence more than anything. That people didn't trust the banking system, the banks didn't trust the banks. Once that issue is proven to be the case, that the system is bankrupt, then this can go into free fall. And the only solution to this is for governments to step in and say, okay, we can't allow this sort of crisis of confidence. We've got to have a system that people can trust. Therefore, we need to have strong re-regulation, or like a Glass-Steagall regulation. Go in and say, we're not going to allow the speculation to govern the system. We're not going to allow speculators
your
to do it.
deposits are in a bank that isn't involved in
Therefore,
gambling.
you've got to go back and re-establish the Glass-Steagall principles. Protect the commercial banking system, re-regulate it, right? Wipe out the speculative side of things, and then go with large-scale credit system investment into infrastructure and so forth. Now, we've got all this on our website. We've got pamphlets. The Glass-Steagall now goes through it in major detail that people can call in for. But really, that's the issue on the table here. The next GFC is on the horizon. How far away, we don't know, but the triggers are there.
And the fight for Glass-Steagall is still the #1 fight that we have to make sure we win. So that's it for this week's CEC report. Call in and get the literature I said, and thanks for tuning in. Tune in next week for more.